Welcome back. We are excited to have you here at Fables Adventures. My name is Bill, and I'm your host, and I do hope that you're enjoying the time that you're spending with us here listening to our stories. If you're curious about where our stories originate, check out the link in the description to our Fables Adventures app for iPhone or iPad, where you can create stories of your own. And if you become a subscriber in the app and contribute to the community feed, we might just feature one of your stories right here on our Spotify or YouTube channel. In the meantime, hit like, subscribe, and follow us here. It means a lot. All of the links and details you need are in the description. Let's jump into today's story, The Pattern Beneath. But before we do, a little warning. This story contains mature psychological horror themes, references to death and burial grounds, colonial violence, and deeply unsettling, ambiguous horror. Today's episode is definitely recommended for mature listeners ages 16 and up. What if the pattern you've been searching for your entire life isn't something you're discovering, but something you're creating? What if you're not the investigator, but the trigger? Meet Cole Sutton, a folklore consultant who has spent 15 years investigating hauntings and disappearances at sites of historical trauma. Burial grounds, mass graves, places where the past was buried but never properly mourned. Cole is brilliant at finding patterns, connecting disappearances to lunar cycles, astronomical events, and forgotten violence sealed beneath the ground. But Cole has never solved a single case. Now, at Ashford University, the pattern is repeating again. The library's foundation is sinking in impossible ways, faster during full moons, reversing during new moons, stopping entirely during eclipses. 4 students have vanished without a trace, and Cole has discovered they were all living or studying directly above a mass grave from 1743, where 700 people were buried and forgotten beneath what is now the university's east wing. The connections are clear. The pattern is unmistakable. Cole is doing what Cole does best, mapping the architecture of horror, documenting the evidence, descending into the sealed chamber beneath the library to confront whatever darkness waits below. But there's another pattern Cole is starting to see, a more terrifying one. 15 years of investigations, 15 years of hauntings at burial sites, and every single one began exactly when Cole arrived. A school built on a slave plantation, a hospital on an indigenous cemetery, a museum on the site of a massacre. All of them started the moment Cole showed up to investigate. What if Cole isn't documenting these disappearances? What if Cole's obsession with finding patterns is itself the pattern? What if Cole's presence at these sites activates something dormant, something that has been using Cole for 15 years without Cole ever knowing? And if that's true, if Cole is the mechanism, the trigger, the choice being made by something vast and patient and absolutely certain, then what happens when Cole finally descends into that sealed chamber? When Cole stands face to face with the missing students who are trying to tell Cole something Cole doesn't want to hear. Is Cole the investigator, the victim, or something else entirely? Get ready for a deeply unsettling psychological horror story about obsession, patterns, and the terrifying possibility that you might be haunted by your own need to understand. This is The Pattern Beneath.
The foundation of Ashford University's main library had been sinking for 3 months. Not dramatically, half an inch here, a quarter inch there, but enough to crack the limestone facade and send facilities into a panic they couldn't quite articulate to the administration. I knew why they couldn't articulate it. Because the sinking followed no logical pattern. It accelerated during full moons, reversed slightly during new moons, and stopped entirely during solar eclipses. Conventional engineering didn't account for celestial mechanics affecting structural integrity. But then again, conventional engineering didn't factor in the mass graves sealed beneath the building's east wing either. My name is Cole Sutton, and I've spent the last 15 years convincing myself I'm a skeptic. I sat in the library's climate-controlled basement, surrounded by Ashford's institutional records, my notebook already filled with connections that probably meant nothing. The university was built in 1887 on land that had been a Lenape burial ground for 2 centuries before that. The colonial settlement that preceded the university had mass-buried victims of a fever outbreak in 1743, 700 people in a pit they tried to forget about. The pit that now served as the library's foundation. The disappearances started 3 months ago. Same time the foundation began sinking. 4 students gone. No bodies. No evidence. Just absence. The kind that leaves families devastated and campuses paranoid. The university hired me as a folklore consultant, which was their diplomatic way of saying they wanted someone to blame when the investigation went nowhere. I had a reputation for that. I spread photographs across the archive table, missing person flyers mostly. Sarah Chen, Senior, Environmental Science. Marcus Webb, Junior, Engineering. Jennifer Holt, Sophomore, Undeclared. David Park, Senior, Architecture. 4 faces staring at me from different angles, different moments in their lives, frozen in the moment before they became statistics. And there it was, the pattern. Sarah Chen lived in Residence Hall C, built in 1952 directly above what was once the burial ground's northern boundary. Marcus Webb worked in the engineering lab in the basement of Morrison Hall, which sat atop the colonial mass grave's eastern extension. Jennifer Holt had her dorm room in Residence Hall E, positioned precisely above what ground-penetrating radar had identified as a concentration of bone fragments from the 1743 outbreak. David Park had been studying in this library, the library which sat directly above the sealed pit itself. I felt it then, that familiar sensation of connection snapping into focus, the world suddenly revealing its hidden architecture. My pulse quickened. This was what I lived for. The moment when chaos resolved into conspiracy. This was also, I knew, the moment when my obsession usually began to cannibalize itself. I'd learned to recognize the warning signs, the way my breathing changed, the compulsive need to verify connections that didn't need verifying, the creeping paranoia that whispered about chosen people and marked targets. I pulled out my phone and called Dr. Patricia Voss, the university's director of facilities. "The foundation," I said without preamble. "Show me the records of exactly where it's sinking." She was waiting for me 20 minutes later in the East Wing, a woman in her 60s with the exhausted expression of someone who'd been asked to solve an impossible problem while pretending it wasn't happening. She led me to a map pinned to the wall of the sub-basement, marked with red dots indicating settlement points. "It's concentrated here," she said, pointing to a cluster of marks, "just east of the main support structure. We can't explain it. The engineer brought in says it doesn't make physical sense. The ground beneath us is solid. There's no geological reason for this movement." I stared at the map. The settlement points formed a pattern, not random, never random. "These coordinates," I said. "Can you tell me what's directly beneath them, underground?" Patricia hesitated. "The sealed chamber, the colonial grave, but Cole, that was sealed in 1892. The cement work was verified. Ground-penetrating radar confirmed no structural weakness, and the psychological impact of suggesting anything other than engineering failure?" "The grave isn't sealed anymore," I said. "Something's happening down there. We can't know that without excavation. and the university will never authorize. Then we don't ask for authorization. I left her staring at me like I'd suggested something illegal, which I had. I was good at that. My apartment was 6 blocks from campus, a converted Victorian that sagged with its own ghosts. I'd chosen it deliberately, back when I was still capable of irony about my career choices. Now I sat on my fire escape, staring at the Ashford campus lights bleeding through the autumn dark, and tried to untangle the knot in my chest. The pattern was clear. The students who disappeared had all been in proximity to the burial grounds, to the sealed mass grave beneath the library. The foundation sinking corresponded to lunar cycles and astronomical events, and I'd arrived in Ashford exactly 3 months ago, the same week the foundation began to fail, the same week the disappearances started. Coincidence. My rational mind insisted on that word like a prayer, but I'd been trained to see past coincidence. I went back through my notes, back through the case files I'd brought with me. Previous investigations, previous disappearances I'd documented, each one tied to sites of historical trauma. A school built on a slave plantation where 3 students vanished during a blood moon. A hospital in Pennsylvania built atop an unmarked indigenous cemetery where 2 nurses disappeared during a solar eclipse. A museum in Colorado built on the site of a massacre where a graduate student was found wandering catatonic after being missing for 4 days, unable to speak or recognize his own family. I'd been investigating hauntings for 15 years. In those 15 years, I'd never solved a single disappearance, but I'd found something else. I'd found a pattern that connected them all, a repeating rhythm, a mechanism, and I couldn't determine if I was discovering it or creating it. That was the real horror, the possibility that my compulsion to find connections was itself the connection, that my presence at these sites somehow activated something dormant, that my obsession was a kind of summoning. My hands were shaking. I recognized this state. This was the edge between investigation and delusion, the place where I'd stumbled before and nearly didn't recover from. I needed to find the remaining students. I needed to know if they were dead or alive, or something else entirely. I needed to know if I was going to disappear next. I waited until 2 in the morning to cut through the library's service entrance. The lock was elementary. Facilities never bothered with real security in the basement. The archive rooms opened easily. I descended past the climate-controlled records, past the mechanical systems, past the point where institutional history ended and something older began. The sealed chamber door was exactly where Patricia's records indicated. Limestone block, 1892 cement work, no visible damage, no visible anything. I pressed my hand against the cool stone and felt it pulse. That's when I heard it. A sound like breathing, like wind through a throat not meant for speech. And beneath it, something else. Voices, distant and overlapping, speaking in languages I didn't recognize. Speaking, maybe, in the voices of 700 people who'd been buried like garbage. I understood then, with a clarity that felt like breaking glass, that I was not investigating this haunting. I was part of it. The realization arrived with such force that I staggered backward. Every disappearance I'd ever investigated, every case file I'd assembled, every connection I'd obsessively mapped, it was all leading here, all leading to me. The pattern wasn't something I was discovering. It was something I was fulfilling. I'd been marked long before I arrived at Ashford, maybe marked since the night I was born, maybe marked since my mother took me to that archaeological dig when I was 6 years old, the one on land that had been a burial ground, the one where she died in a collapse that the record said was impossible, the one where I survived because something below caught me, The door to the sealed chamber was opening. I didn't run. I stood there in the basement darkness, my flashlight pointing at my feet, and waited. Because I needed to know. Because my obsession had finally reached its logical conclusion. Because I had to understand whether I was the investigator, or the mechanism, or the choice being made by something vast and patient, and absolutely certain of what it wanted. The cold that came from the opening door was absolute. It carried the smell of earth and bone and time. It carried voices, and through the gathering darkness I could see them, not clearly, never clearly enough to be real, but clear enough to unmistakable. The missing students stood in the threshold between worlds, their eyes open and aware and fixed directly on me. Sarah Chen reached out her hand. Her mouth moved. She was trying to tell me something, but I couldn't hear her over the sound of the building breathing around me, the weight of buried history pressing upward through cracked foundations, through centuries of denial, through every carefully sealed tomb and forgotten grave. She was trying to tell me that I was next, or that I'd always been first,